We want to make sure that we have the basic needs of government, but that's what a state government should do. The basic needs of government. I think you got to look at it as a three-legged stool. One is the tax side, two is the spending side, and the third side, and I think this is something that's really different for Louisiana, is really the design of state government. Louisiana was designed so that all roads lead to Baton Rouge and everybody has their hand out. And I think we've got to flip that script. When you look at the states that are really growing, they put more control in the hands of the locals, where the needs are known even better. I want the locals to have more control. I want the locals to be able to keep those resources closer to home and let the people of those regions decide whether or not that we need X, Y, and Z tax for this specific project. And I think you'll see more engagement by people when they feel that their voice is being heard. And I think you do that better on a local level than we do on a state level, for sure.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us once again on the State of Freedom.
The State of Freedom is a listener-supported podcast. We're committed to pursuing the truth about policymaking, decisions, and situations in Louisiana and at the national level that stand to impact our freedoms.
Please become a monthly supporter of the State of Freedom at freedomstate.us as we continue to expand the voice of liberty across Louisiana and beyond.
State Senator Thomas Presley is with us today to talk about the special session on taxes that's underway. He is a friend of the show and a state legislator who has stood firmly on conservative values and constitutional principles against strong headwinds. We're so happy to have him with us today. And before we jump into the conversation, let me go ahead and read the scripture of the day. It's Psalm chapter 78, verses 52 to 26. And it says, "Then, like a shepherd leading his sheep, God led his people out of tyranny, guiding them through the wilderness like a flock. Safely and carefully, God led them out with nothing to fear, but their enemies he led into the sea. He took care of them there once and for all. Eventually, God brought his people to the Holy Land, to a land of hills that he had prepared for them. He drove out and scattered all the peoples occupying the land, staking out an inheritance, a portion for each of Israel's tribes. Yet for all of this, they still rebelled and refused to follow his ways, provoking to anger the God Most High." And this whole Psalm chapter 78 is a strong warning to us right now. And I just encourage you all to go ahead and read the Psalm in its entirety, chapter 78. But what struck me about it was how it parallels where we are as a nation right now. And the lesson is that complacency and a lukewarm relationship with the Lord have no place in us if we want to continue to advance in the victory that the Lord brought us. He has rescued us from the grip of tyranny, just as they point out in the Psalm, and our role is to continue in truth with him, to continue to walk with him, to continue to be obedient and faithful to him, come what may. May we not be like the Israelites of Exodus and Deuteronomy, who continually forgot the goodness of God, continually forgot his miracles, and rebelled against him to their own destruction because they thought they could handle it in their own power. We are at a moment when it's absolutely imperative to choose faith and to remain steadfast in our love for the Lord as we move forward.
You know, Danielle, my tendency, that's such a beautiful psalm. My tendency is always to, recognize my dependence upon God when I need something, when I'm in difficult situations. And then once he answers our prayers, which he always does in his own way, we tend to begin to cultivate the illusion of self-sufficiency once again. So I think the challenge is not to become complacent when God does hear our prayers and answers our prayers and puts us in a good position, to not remain complacent, but to continue to move forward. Speaking of someone who is always moving forward and doing good things in the legislature is Senator Thomas Presley, as you said, been on the show before, and as you said, a great friend. Thomas, what a pleasure to have you with us this morning for a few minutes.
Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Tell us right here at the start, Thomas, the tax and budget session that you're in the middle of now, or at least you'll be starting tomorrow on the Senate side, but some things are already underway. Based on what you've seen, what is the objective generally and the ideal outcome as you see it of this session?
Look, I think that Louisiana for so long has been left behind by our other states, by our sister states who were really competing with to try to drive business and opportunity, jobs and opportunities to individuals. The last time Louisiana grew comparatively to our sister states, meaning we gained a member of Congress, was 1910.
Wow.
1960, Louisiana and Florida both had 10 electoral votes. Of course, today we have 8, meaning we have 6 members of Congress and our 2 senators, and Florida has 30.
Wow.
Really shows you what good conservative policies can do for a state. And I believe that fixing our tax code, making it a flatter, more reasonable tax code will help drive jobs and opportunities to Louisiana. And so many of my colleagues and I are focused on doing just that. I certainly think that Governor Landry was given a mandate when he won in the general election without having to go to a runoff about the needs to transform Louisiana and bring in some real changes. And I think that his administration certainly has the goal of doing just that. I think when you look at lowering the personal income tax to what would be the second lowest in the country, the ones that have 0, of course, is number 1, and that's ultimately the goal. Certainly lowering our corporate income tax, looking at the inventory tax, looking at the franchise tax and eliminating that as well, I think are really some things that are going to drive and spur innovation and spur opportunity to Louisiana. When you look at the package as a whole, the Tax Foundation, which is a national group that looks at each individual state's tax policies and it ranks us. Their new ranking shows us at 40. And if this package passes as is, it would move to number 8. Now, the question is what would is that package going to pass in its entirety? Seriously doubt that, knowing my colleagues in the legislature and our desire to put our own stamp on some of this legislation. But I do think that the ultimate goal of lowering the personal income tax, of driving innovation, of driving opportunity to Louisiana remains steadfast for all of us. And we're going to continue to have that debate as the legislation moves to the Senate side.
Thomas, you have brought so much encouragement just in those short few minutes. I have felt kind of a little cloud over this session just because I'm concerned about the direction it might take. A little concern about are the moves being made bold enough to get us where we need to go? And I want to pick up on your point about the 3% flat income tax. What's the direction of travel for that? It sounds like there's a plan, hopefully, to ultimately get rid of it altogether. What's the time frame for making that happen if we even get to the 3% this time?
Yeah, there are a lot of conversations on that. And I think really you've got to look at our taxing and spending together. And that's something that I think is a challenge in a special session. For me, I want to cut spending on the state level as well.
Praise God.
and
This is
praise
my
God.
number one concern.
We're talking about that.
I told Chris I wanted him to carry a snare drum through the legislature saying, just cut spending, just
Sure.
cut spending.
No
You
doubt.
never hear it.
And look, I think there are needs that the state has that we need to address. And I think certainly we want to make sure our roads are in much better condition than they are currently. We want to make sure we have got schools. We want to make sure that we have the basic needs of government. But that's what a state government should do. The basic needs of government. I think you got to look at it as a 3-legged stool. 1 is the tax side, 2 is the spending side, and the third side, and I think this is something that's really different for Louisiana, it's really the design of state government. Louisiana was designed so that all roads lead to Baton Rouge and everybody has their handout. And I think we've got to flip that script. When you look at the states that are really growing, they put more control in the hands of the locals, where the needs are known even better. Certainly in my area of the state, in Shreveport in Northwest Louisiana, we always fail compared to our sister cities and regions of the state as far as bringing the resources that we send from North Louisiana down to Baton Rouge. Trying to bring those back as legislators is always difficult because we have less people down there, and B, the voice of the bureaucrats of the lobbying corps is based in Baton Rouge and in Lafayette and in New Orleans. So that little corridor is often where the resources go. And I want to flip that script. I want the locals to have more control. I want the locals to be able to keep those resources closer to home and let the people of those regions decide whether or not that we need X, Y, and Z tax for this specific project. And I think you'll see more engagement by people when they feel that their voice is being heard. And I think you do that better on a local level than we do on a state level for sure.
Yeah.
And I'd like the state government to go back to the basics and limit that government, that power. Just like our national government should be limited in power, so should the state government, and we should put more power in the hands of the people. And so I certainly think that's a number one goal. B, and I think the spending side, as you talked about, when we look at the personal income tax and the need to have a personal income tax, again, I would like to flip that script and lower our state budget. We certainly did that last year. We had about a 2% drop in the state budget last year. I'd like to continue to see that trend moving forward. When you look at the state budget, so much of it is federal dollars, and it's hard for anyone to say no to what's viewed as free money. But we all know that that's not free money. That's
right.
The bearing of the cost of that money that is coming from Washington isn't on us. It's not on the federal government. It's on our kids and our grandkids who are having to come back at some point and stop this tragic deficit that we continue to spend in DC. But I think, and we've talked about this previously, turning off that spigot is really difficult. Turning it on is easy. Turning it off is hard. And I think that our nation needs to wake up to the debt that we are facing and the debt burden, much of which is being held by our enemies. The amount of money that China holds of our national debt is significant. And I think that's concerning from a geopolitical standpoint as well. And so certainly, I think it's all intertwined, but I'd like to see us continue to move forward with a more fiscally responsible budget, as well as a more fiscally conservative tax code.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, Thomas, that people so rarely talk about, particularly legislators, is how do we cut spending?
Sure.
How do we tighten the belt?
Well,
it's just because it's not, frankly, popular, because anytime you cut spending, you're cutting money that's going somewhere, right?
That's right. And I think that, in our tax code, certainly with the exemptions and credits, you have seen the folks that are heavily involved in politics on a funding and fundraising standpoint, they're the winners in our tax code. And we've got to get away from that and give the power back to the people. I believe in cutting as many, and I truly would like to cut all credits and exemptions and lower the rates as much as we possibly can. Everyone's paying in. I think that's a fairer way of doing it and a more appropriate way of doing it, and something that Louisiana has certainly gone away from. But I also think when you talk about the spending side, what we see from Republican administrations, from Democrat administrations for, decade after decade in Louisiana, is that they'll cut the things that have the heartstrings being tugged on, right? Yeah. And so that's the proposal, is that we'll cut special needs services. And I'm one that believes that government, you've got to be a compassionate conservative, and you've got to be able to, yes, cut the spending, but also when it's the least among us that have no ability to help themselves, that's part of the role of government as well, is making sure that we are caring for those that are the least among us. So I think that's part of the challenge, is getting in and really digging into the details of the budget to find out exactly where we can cut, where we should be cutting. And just because there are federal dollars that are attached to it doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at that program to potentially cut if the spending is not necessary or not needed. But I think the other side of this, and we certainly last week had a constitutional amendment on the ballot that was approved with almost 70%. That was, again, handcuffing the legislature from looking at where we should spend our money and where we shouldn't. And it was a new requirement that any dollars that are given to us by the federal government from the alternative energy sources that are developed off the Gulf of Mexico would go to coastal restoration. I'm 100% in favor of coastal restoration. And I certainly want to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to ensure the coast is here for, again, our kids and grandkids. But at the same time, when I represent the Soda Parish in Northwest Louisiana, and they sent $180 million in severance tax alone last year to Baton Rouge, and we weren't able to collect that much money to bring it back home, That is concerning for my region of the state. And I think that's something that we've got to be able to work with as well, of making sure certainly that we have dollars in our general fund, but those dollars are being distributed to the needs and issues that are facing all regions of the state and all areas of the state and all people of the state.
Yeah. Thomas, I think people probably would have been more inclined to oppose that amendment that you're talking about if, in fact, they saw our officials and our government making real measurable steps to be more fiscally responsible and to cut spending in areas where it can. A lot of citizens look at that amendment and say, well, it's better if revenue is generated from alternative renewable energy that it be restricted to coastal restoration than to be put in a general fund where it can be potentially squandered elsewhere, which our government tends to squander money.
Sure.
So I just think that the approach was, but I think if people had more trust in our government generally with regard to the good stewardship of their tax dollars, they probably would have been more inclined to oppose that amendment. That's just my view.
I completely agree with you, Chris. I think that's exactly the challenge that we have in Louisiana. But we've got to remember that we elect people every 4 years to go to Baton Rouge and to serve the people. And if they're not doing a good job, if they're not being fiscally conservative, if they're not holding out their responsibility, then they need to be outed from office and booted from office. And that's something that I think that the people of the state have to try to put some trust back into the people that we're electing. Because when we handcuff the legislature from being able to spend those dollars on the necessary needs, and again, I'm all for coastal restoration, but at the expense of what else? And when we have very few areas that we can look at cutting, specifically higher education and healthcare, that's really a challenge as we look at the taxing reform along with the spending reform, because you've got to be able to cover some of those costs. And when we're handcuffed on the spending side to only cover the things that are not in constitutionally mandated funds, I think that's a challenge for the reform effort as well.
Yeah.
Well, and the whole thing may be moot if we're moving into a situation where the federal government is not going to be subsidizing these ridiculous wind projects, which ultimately will not make any money, period, on their own merits, should the government not be involved.
Yes, 100%. And I do think we're going to see some movement on that front. I think you're going to see a lot of discussion on the energy front generally, because we've got a lot of need for energy as our technology increases and improves. And that's a lot of the discussion that I've had with our economic development folks is dealing with making sure that we have sufficient energy for the new projects that are coming online and the jobs of the future, because that is something that Louisiana actually does fairly well compared to our sister states. We actually have a little bit more energy than a lot of folks and available energy, but we also have available water. And as you look at the resources that are necessary for the improvement and advancement of the technology world, those two things are essential, and I hope that will put us on the correct footing, along with a reasonably designed tax plan, along with looking at occupational licensing reform, along with fixing our spending on the state level. That'll move Louisiana forward as we look at the next 10 years or 20 years of time, and hopefully, and certainly my goal is to grow our population, grow our economy, and grow the opportunities for the people of this great state.
I'm excited to share a fantastic opportunity for State of Freedom listeners who are interested in investing in precious metals or even starting a home-based business in the precious metals industry. Metal Stacks is a precious metals collectors club where you can buy your metals at the best prices on the market, actual dealer cost. They are beating the big sites. They have no credit card fees and no minimums. If you're just interested in purchasing metals at a great price, visit metalstacks.com/dwalker. Get to shopping. That helps me out. I get the commission. You can also refer people to Metal Stacks for an additional income. If you're interested in learning about the referral business aspect of Metal Stacks, email me directly at Danielle@freedomstate.us for more information.
Yeah. Let's talk about the corporate franchise tax. Thomas, believe it might have been Senator Elaine a couple of years ago, or even 2023, brought a bill to eliminate the corporate franchise tax. I can't remember whether or not it failed or whether it was simply vetoed by the governor. It looks like that's also a part of the package here. What are your thoughts on eliminating the corporate franchise tax And do you think it'll get through this time?
Yeah, look, I think the franchise tax is something that's keeping jobs and opportunities away from the people of Louisiana. And I certainly think that we need to address this. It seems to have some momentum in the conversations that I've had on, eliminating it completely, which is exactly what we need to do. We need to incentivize folks to come to Louisiana, businesses to come to Louisiana. And this is something that's really holding us back. Again, when I'm talking to the economic development folks, the folks that are helping us bring in jobs and opportunities to Louisiana, this is one of the big issues that they have on being able to bring companies from other states into Louisiana, because it just doesn't make sense to have a chokehold of a tax structure that's not clear, that's unknown, and this is one that I think is easily eliminated if we do our responsibility or do the responsible thing and move forward with ensuring a fiscally sound budget as we go forward as well.
Yeah, and we also saw, Thomas, a 4.5% tax on streaming services passed out of committee in the House. And I wonder, is this kind of a piece of a game of three-card Monte where, the government gets to keep all of the funds and we're just changing who pays? What's your take on that? You think it'll pass the Senate?
Look, I think a lot of conversations are going to be continued to be had on the reshuffling of the tax code. The governor, when he spoke last week at the opening ceremony of session, talked about looking at this as a package of legislation. And really what we're trying to do is put it into a form that's easy to understand and easy to determine how much money we're going to make, where the money's coming from. And while knowing that the money it's not being made, right? I mean, the government doesn't make money. The people of Louisiana are the ones that are paying the government and paying our taxes so that we can have those shared resources together. I think there's going to be a lot of conversation that continues on things like taxing streaming services. But that also said, I think that when you talk to Secretary Nelson, when you talk to the governor's team, we always paid for sales tax at Blockbuster, right? And this is the new generation of a sales tax basically on the Blockbuster video that you run it in the early 2000s and late 80s. And the streaming services, I think, are certainly an area that I could see expanding the sales tax to, especially when it means that we're lowering our personal income tax, that we're lowering our corporate tax, that we're eliminating the franchise tax. That looking at the whole package, I think, is really important. But I certainly want to make sure that the dollars that come into the state of Louisiana continue to, we certainly look at the needs of the state. But again, when we look at that spending side, we've got to start being more fiscally conservative. And I think that's something that's really put us at a disadvantage comparatively to our sister states over the last really 20 years in particular, but really even longer than that.
Yeah, and I think, that tax makes a lot more sense to me than another one that is in the proposal, which was a proposed tax on repairs to farm equipment, cars, and home appliances. I mean, when you look at streaming, that's definitely a choice. But from a conservative perspective, you're not going to get your tractor fixed because you want to.
Sure, no doubt. No doubt. And I think that's, again, there are going to be trade-offs in this. For me, lowering the personal income tax as much as we possibly can, I think is really the direction we should be going. When you look at the states that are growing, Texas, Tennessee, Florida, Washington State, which is a blue state, they all have 0% income tax. And it's incentivizing folks to come in. The fact that you can work in Texas and make 5% more just because of the way that our tax code is set up is crazy. I mean, for us in Northwest Louisiana and Chris knows this, having grown up here, we're 15 minutes from the border. My district goes all the way to the Texas border, and it's a whole lot easier to say, you know what, I'm gonna not have a 5% income tax, and just work in Texas. It's really putting us at a competitive disadvantage. I represent Logansport. Logansport is a border town. There's a bridge between Logansport and Texas. The grocery stores on the Texas side. The jobs are really blowing up on the Texas side. Logansport was always the head, of their dueling community, but it's really fallen behind because of our tax code. I mean, I think that's something that we've got to continue to pay attention to and look at as we move forward.
Yeah. Thomas, to be clear, your goal ultimately is to eliminate the individual personal income tax entirely.
That's certainly my
in
goal.
Louisiana.
I certainly think that having had 4 years, spending 4 years with Secretary Nelson, I know that that's ultimately his goal as well. But, again, it's a large amount of money that you're talking about, and we can't just go in and, eliminate that and not replace at least a portion of those dollars. I mean, when you're looking at the general fund, which is really the dollars that are coming from Louisiana taxpayers, it's about $14 billion. While we look at our budget, which is about 47 billion, and that's the number that most of the media will use. That's not all Louisiana tax dollars. Those are the federal dollars. Those are fees and collections from things like your fishing license, your hunting license, of the general fund budget, because those are dedicated to certain funds. But the general fund dollars are really what we're discussing and trying to make sure that we have the necessary resources to be able to provide state government.
Yeah. And let me ask this real quick. So Texas and other states that have eliminated the personal income tax, there's no doubt there's a connection between that and the fact that their economies are more thriving than ours.
That's certainly my view. I don't think there's any question in the world. But again, it's not just the personal income tax. It's also the way that they've designed government. In Texas, so much of the responsibility lies on the local communities, the counties in Texas, or the cities, where in Louisiana, many of the city roads and streets are actually state roads, which is just mind-blowing to me. I mean, we should not have the responsibility of repaving major thoroughfares. I mean, Uri Drive in Shreveport, which is part of Highway 1, and I understand that that's a state highway, but there are many others. Line Avenue in Shreveport is also a state highway. That's just crazy to me, and something that I think the design of government needs to work on. And we need to do that in Baton Rouge, of flipping the script on what our role and responsibility is as state government, as well as the role and responsibilities of local governments. You've seen that in Tennessee. You've seen it in Florida. Florida really, if you look back in the early 60s, they turned it on. And granted, they've got the most beautiful beaches in the United States. Hawaii, you may disagree with that, but certainly, they've got beautiful beaches. They've got lots of opportunities there. But the early 60s, they put the right policies in place. And I think 64 years later, they've really reaped the benefit from that. And that's the Louisiana I want to see. I know that we've got challenges. I know that my colleagues also agree with me that we have challenges in Louisiana. But when you look at what we can do for our kids and our grandkids, we can set this state up for tremendous success. We've got the best natural resources in the world, from the Mississippi River to fertile farmland to a beautiful coast, to wonderful agriculture opportunities here. And let's be honest, our best resources are people. We're innovative, we're caring. Just look at Louisiana following a storm, and we know that Louisianians care about each other, regardless of political party, regardless of where you are in the state. We care. And the people of this great state deserve a great government that's set up for them to succeed. Not for the state government to succeed, but for the people to succeed.
Yeah. That's a great point. Speaking of returning power to the people, changing our structure of government, and vesting more authority in local governments, within that context, I want to ask you about the 0.45 sales tax, which, as you know, Thomas, was set to expire.
Absolutely.
And now it looks like there's a possibility that is going to become permanent. We had Paul Hurd on our show, who has done pretty comprehensive plan about economic development in Louisiana. And he said, along the lines of returning power to local municipalities, that we need to eliminate or severely reduce state sales taxes and allow local municipalities to determine their own sales tax structure and keep more of their money at home. What is your thought on that?
Well, I completely agree with Paul on that front. I think that, again, it goes back to that three-legged stool. You can't do this in a vacuum. And I think you've got to talk about the spending side, but our locals have to realize that, they're going to have more responsibility as well. If we cut certain tasks and responsibilities from the state government, it's going to have to be picked up, or could be picked up, by the locals if they choose to pick that up. But I think your metropolitan areas certainly would try to pick a large portion of the services or duties up. I think the roads example is a prime example for me of, those certainly we need to work on our state highways, but really a lot of in our interstates, that's responsibility from the state. But when you look at the local roads, that should be handled by our locals. Paul talked a lot about, the need to cut 5% across the board from our agencies. I don't think he's wrong on that front. I think that we certainly should be looking and seeking the opportunities to cut spending and waste in government. And some of our departments and agencies are so big and so bloated that it just takes time for people to go, new legislators or new elected officials or new appointees, to go in and try to unveil what can be cut, what should be cut. I certainly have tried that on Senate Finance, which I sit on, of asking the questions, of asking how the process works, of can we eliminate a job here or there, which saves it certainly would save the state from the salary and the benefits, a significant amount of money in a private citizen's hands. But the state government looks at it and says, oh, it's just $100,000. When you start looking
Exactly.
at it by the private eye of this is going to affect, my tax rates or my colleagues or my constituents or the people of Louisiana's tax rates, and we put it in that vein, I think it makes a big difference as we look forward. But I do think it takes a little bit of time to figure out the bureaucracy and the bureaucrats who understand our budget process probably better than most elected officials, because they've lived it, they've been in it. They don't always want to answer the question that we mean to ask. You have to ask directly to know, that they're not going to lie to you, but they're not necessarily going to give you the information that you need unless you seek it out specifically. And so I think that's something that we're going to continue to see. I know that the governor's administration is going to continue to work on trying to streamline government as well and try to make sure that we are being accountable to the people of the state when it comes to being fiscally conservative and fiscally conservative moving forward. I also think that my colleagues in the legislature, certainly those of us that are on finance and the other budget committees, are doing exactly that as well. You can watch our hearings that'll happen in March and April, where the agency heads will come in, where we'll ask specific questions and try to nail down exactly where we could be more conservative or certainly make some cuts to try to affect our budget a little bit.
We are so honored to be affiliate partners for General Michael Flynn's movie, Flynn, Deliver the Truth, Whatever the Cost. Support General Flynn and the State of Freedom by shopping the Flynn movie store directly from the button on our homepage at freedomstate.us or through our affiliate link, flynnmovie.com/TSOF podcast. On that site, you can purchase the DVD, which comes with a streaming link. You can pick up Flynn movie merchandise and get his complete 5GW book series.
And in talking about spending, when you are in the legislature right now, what's your sense? Do you feel like, on balance, there's a big block of people who are insistent on being quote unquote revenue neutral? Or do you think people are really starting to be willing to take a look in a meaningful way at cutting spending and in significant numbers that would mean that it could actually get done?
As far as in this session or generally?
Generally.
Yeah, so I think there's definitely that view. I think the challenge that you have in this session as we look forward is, making sure that the fiscal notes are correct or as correct as they possibly can be, so that we aren't looking at $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion hole in the next year's fiscal budget, right? We will design next year's budget and the governor will put it out at the end of January. We'll start looking at it and appropriations on the House side and then finance on the Senate side and pass that as we go through the regular session. But I do think that question, we've got to make sure that the resources are there in order to go ahead and make those strong changes and the necessary changes. I think that my colleagues generally have the view of myself, which is we need to make sure that we have the necessary resources for state government, while at the same time being fiscally conservative, taking a hard look to make sure that we're using the people's money appropriately and effectively. You're seeing that in the Department of Transportation and Development right now. We have gone in and we're having a full audit of that department. I think that was desperately needed. I think it's been needed for decades. Certainly during my lifespan, I think it's crazy that we have roads that are as poor as they are.
Yeah.
considering the amount of money that that department is getting. I'd like to do the same thing with the Department of Health and make sure that the resources that are being put towards healthcare are also being effectively used and efficiently used. We spend about half our budget on healthcare. And a lot of that money, again, is drawdown money from CMS, from the Department of Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services. But we need to make sure that those resources are being used effectively. When you look at the amount of money we're spending today compared to pre-Obamacare, it's insane that our health outcomes remain the same. And we are dead last or next to dead last in just about every metric when it comes to healthcare. Granted, we love our food, we love our culture, and that oftentimes is not contributes the best opportunities for good health care.
Optimal health.
But it's certainly something that we need to continue to look at. And I think we will do that as well.
Yeah. Well,
So
I think
it sounds
Thomas,
like sorry, Chris, it sounds like you're looking at potentially incremental change, seeing the fruit of the original, the first cuts of change, and then hopefully making bigger changes as we go along that path.
Yeah, that's certainly my view. I think the first step is the structure, and we've got to change the structure of how we collect taxes. And that's really what this session is all about, is making sure that we are putting it in a structure that's understandable, that the people can read and understand. And that's something that we're going to continue to work on as we look forward to the next couple of weeks. I think as we move forward from there, we've got to look at spending, and we've got to look again at the way that we are handling government between the state and the locals. I'd like to again see more of that power handed back to the locals with some guardrails in place from the state on making sure that those dollars are used effectively and wisely as well.
and I'll tell you, Thomas, those three things right there, looking at ways to make our tax structure understandable to the average citizen, looking at meaningful ways to cut spending, and then, of course, as you mentioned, auditing some of these bloated agencies. Those are three ways right there, I think, to dramatically increase the trust, that the average Louisiana citizen has in our government. And it's good to know that those points are being highlighted. Let me ask you about this. There's also talk of a flat 3.5% corporate tax rate. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I think that, I'm a believer in flat rates generally. I think it makes a lot of sense to have it flat, neutral, known to the people and known to these businesses as well. So I think that makes a lot of sense. As far as the 3.5 versus 3.6 versus 3 a lot of it comes down to the numbers and how we're actually getting to the final number, right? I think that's important to look at the background information that's being used to develop the fiscal notes, because I don't want to see us in 6 months be in a fiscal hole that's going to keep us from being able to make the revolutionary changes that are necessary for Louisiana to move forward.
Yeah. As you look at this in totality, assuming there'll be tweaking, assuming there'll be adjustments to some of these items, do you feel that we can come out of this session with a net benefit to the average Louisiana taxpayer?
I mean, I think that certainly, that personal income tax to me is a huge issue. When you're looking at jobs, again, in Texas versus even in Whatcom, Texas, a 5% change in, the amount of money that you're making, I think is a large amount to the average person.
Big.
I certainly think that we need to do all we can to, continue to keep those numbers as low as possible as far as the percentage that's being taken by the government for use and state services. But I think that we've got to do as much as we can to help the average person in Louisiana be able to provide food and groceries for their family, to be able to provide an opportunity for them to have a vehicle and gas in their cars, and be able to provide for their families. That's really what the American dream is all about, is making your opportunity to help build the next generation a reality. And we've done a poor job in Louisiana of building opportunities and hope for the people of the state. My hope and my optimism lies in that exact thing, is creating a Louisiana that allows for our kids and our grandkids to have a better opportunity for the future and to stay right here in Louisiana. And that's something that I think we can do. by working together to ensure that there are opportunities available. And again, I think that the tax code is step one in the process. Things like occupational licensing reform, which we were able to do last year, I think is also really important. And certainly the state spending, that's essential to making sure that Louisiana has a future that's brighter than today.
Yeah. And at the top of the conversation, Thomas, you mentioned that Governor Landry came in with a heck of a mandate to make some big changes to the way government in Louisiana is managed and run. With Trump's election, he too has, I think that mandate has probably underscored that people are looking for pretty much a wholesale change of the way that government is functioning, the size of government. Do you get the sense that the Trump election will embolden the state legislature to take even bigger risks or bigger moves than maybe they would have had we been operating in a different environment going forward?
I certainly think that the state legislature understands that we've missed a golden opportunity over the last 20 years as the jobs and opportunities have flooded to the South. Louisiana has stayed stagnant. And in fact, we've lost population compared to our sister states. And I think we've actually lost raw population numbers in the last couple of years. That's concerning. And I think that weighs on all of us that are serving in Baton Rouge of, it's time for bold action. It's time for big steps. And certainly the election of President Trump to his second term in office, I think has reignited the need for big steps, for bold action, and for the need for Louisiana to move forward as our country moves forward.
Yeah.
My hope is that we'll see a more reshoring of American jobs, particularly in healthcare and pharmaceuticals. The number of our pharmaceuticals that are being manufactured in Southeast Asia is mind-blowing to me, particularly when you talk about the strength that China currently has in the South China Sea and the war games that they seem to be wanting to play with us and the Navy and our merchants that are trying to bring products back over from Southeast Asia. That's concerning. And my hope is that Louisiana can be ready to go. When you look at our infrastructure again, from the rail lines to the interstates, we are to the ports. We're primed for manufacturing and transportation jobs. We're primed in Northwest Louisiana for oil and gas jobs, as well as the rest of the state for the most part. We're primed to be a healthcare center. We're primed, of course, having a 4-star commanded Air Force base to be a real power in the global defense and the defense of our American needs and interests, as we have Barksdale here as well. So I hope that those things will all help us. I also think having not only President Trump in office, but also having Speaker Johnson and Majority Leader Scalise, as well as likely 2 senators that are going to be chairing committees in the Senate on the Senate side. That's enormous for our state as well. We're primed for real expansion and real opportunities over the next 4 to 10 years, in my eyes. We just got to make sure that the policies that are in place allow that possibility and allow the people to be able to succeed.
And a great, great opportunity indeed we have. You're exactly right. Well, Senator Thomas Presley, as always, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thank you so much for your insights. Look forward to seeing you down at the legislature, sir.
Great being on with y'all. Thanks so much for having me. I look forward to doing it again soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Have a good one.
Thanks for joining us today on the State of Freedom. Be sure and check out the show notes for this episode. You can always go there and find the calls to action and resources mentioned in the show, and you can find out more information about our advertisers there as well. If you want to learn more about us or support our work, visit freedomstate.us. To get involved with Louisiana Citizen Advocacy Group, visit LACAG.org. We'll see you next time. God bless.